Welcome again to
And
the Explaining History podcast. And I am delighted to be joined today by historian Jean Pfaelzer, Professor of History at the University of Delaware. We did have there's a longer version of that, but we decided to condense it for now. And we have a fascinating exploration today about the hidden history of California as a slave state. Normally, when we talk about slave states, rightly, we consider the states of the Confederacy, and that springs to mind because of the fact that they were the combatants in the Civil War, and of course the civil rights period that comes later. Obviously, the history is centered around there, but it's not as simple as that. The long and bloody history of slavery extends throughout the United States in all sorts of different forms, and California is, despite its kind of outward appearance, has a long history of it. Jean has just written a superb book, which I've been reading, California, a Slave State, and we'll talk more about that later. But firstly, Jean, welcome to the podcast.
thank you for having me.
Okay. So to begin with, perhaps what we can do is talk a little bit about how the book came about, and perhaps a little bit about the research too. Tell us about it.
I had finished my last book called Driven Out, The Forgotten War Against Chinese Americans. And it's the story of the over 300 roundups, purges, expulsions, and the resistance by the first Chinese Americans who had come to the United States. And I had collected many archives for that book. It was my first trade book, and I didn't expect it to have the audience or the impact that it ended up having. And in talking about it and looking through the photographs that I collected for that book, a little photograph that someone had handed me really haunted me. And I stared at it. It's been over my desk. And it's an image of a very young Chinese girl. I think she's about 12 to 14 years old. And it's a small frame, and she's behind a cage. And this young girl was a kidnapped child prostitute who had been seized in Guangdong, in the ports of Canton, maybe in Hong Kong. She had crate in a padded crate. She had been taken off the dock, sold at the port in San Francisco, very much like we think of slave sales in Louisiana.
Mm-hmm.
She had been taken to a locked brothel in Chinatown in San Francisco and kept behind a caged door. There, she solicited customers as they passed by. The cage would be open. She serviced the customers, sometimes up to 20 a day, which was unthinkable for me. And then her owner or pimp, who would have been the wife of a Chinese merchant, would take the money, draw open the curtain, and sell her a princess. Her picture, what kept coming up was what happened to the 13th Amendment. I kind of knew, in fact, there was a tong, and she had been taken in by the tong and strip searched and sold.
Yes.
So as I looked at this picture, and I have two daughters, as I looked at this picture, I was just haunted by how did this come to be How did it
Mm.
take apart my notion of California? So this little girl is one bookend
Right.
of California, a slave state. There are many, but the one that made me take keyboard in hand was up in Northern California. I read in the local newspaper, this was about 8-9 years ago, that a 15-year-old girl had escaped from a marijuana grow up in Northern California, very close to where I have a cabin. I love Northern California, the redwoods, the lagoons, and this felt very close to home. This 15-year-old girl had been wandering the streets of Hollywood. She was a runaway, homeless, and she gets picked up by two guys who drive her 800 miles up the length of the state. And she's locked in a metal crate. They drill 2 holes into the crate, one to prod her and one to hose her down. And they let her out to sexually service the growers, perhaps the field workers, or to trim the buds from the cannabis plants in late August and early September. It's very hot. She was in a place called Lake County, an inland county. One day they take her to Sacramento. They need to do the state capital. They need to do some shopping, and they lock her in a motel room while they go shopping. She sees a telephone, dials 911, and she frees herself. And that this is very close to where we have a cabin that it's been in my family for 30 years. It felt very close to home. I'm surrounded by what's called the Emerald Triangle up here, where I am speaking to you from. It's one of the marijuana capitals of the world. People are quite casual about it up here. And I stumbled into the fact that there were trafficked field workers working in the marijuana grows. But mostly I was just haunted by this kid, her courage and the horrific brutality, humiliation, fear, rapes that she endured. And I just kept wondering, how did this happen in this beautiful part of the world where the redwoods meet the coast? How did this happen here? And what had happened to the 13th Amendment? So those were the 2 bookends that drove me into this history. And then it went much, much further back than I'd initially conceived.
Yes, because I mean, the book goes back, even before the kind of shall we say, the Anglo-European settlement of California. It goes back into the sort of the Spanish period, and also I noticed that you look at how there was a Russian kind of Pacific slave trade. So it's a kind of quite a long history of California, of the prevalence of slavery in California, and obviously it talks about the treatment of the Native American peoples. I think that there's one thing that that really resonates with me when you talk about what happened to the 13th Amendment, and this is something that I have talked about in this podcast a lot, is this kind of the fallacy of happy ever afters. And the way in which history is taught, and it's not so much a criticism of high school history teaching, because high school history teachers do the best they can with what they've got. But we teach this thing in the UK particularly, and my guess is it probably happens in America, is we teach this illusory happy ever after. We teach it after the emancipation of the slaves in America. We teach it about the ending of the British slave trade. We teach it about the civil rights era. that after a certain kind of particularly momentous event, like and it's sort of we follow this kind of movie script in our heads, that when often a heroic white man says, right, that bad thing is over and done with, then reason and compassion prevail, and this is simply not true. With California, because it has the sort of the reputation of being one of the more liberal states of America, how well that reputation is actually deserved, I don't know. Does it manage to evade kind of quite a lot of scrutiny, do you think?
I think historians have presumed, and activists and politicians have presumed for a long time, the North-South divide of slavery in the United States. And they think about the Confederacy and the free states. They don't always, although more and more, consider the way that slavery had plantation slavery and the profits from plantation slavery had seeped into the North, with ships being built in New England, with the insurance companies in Boston insuring human beings, the bodies of human beings, the profits, the tax profits from cotton and tobacco. I didn't know that, and also the mills, that all those beautiful mills on the rivers up in New England that are milling cotton, people hadn't really put together the obvious, like, where did all that cotton come from? I didn't know that New York had considered seceding, and that had to do with the port of New York, that if there was a civil war or if plantation slavery came to an end, the port in New York would go broke, because that was the transfer point, not just of human beings, but the transfer point of cotton, and also the source for tobacco, with huge profits that were shipped all over the world. So it was much more extensive and profitable in the North. And those discussions are now happening more and more. What wasn't happening was what happened out West. And in terms of plantation slavery, I didn't know. And Nick, I went to Berkeley for my BA and MA. I was really lucky. I studied with the best. I worked with Kenneth Stamp, who is one of the foundational historians about American slavery. And no one talked about California. California's slavery begins with the invasion by the Spanish in 1769, and it goes through to modern human trafficking, like the girl that I had talked about. In terms of plantation slavery, even as a Californian who had studied this stuff, I didn't know that plantation owners marched 2,000 enslaved African Americans marched across the plains, or shipped them down to Panama. There was no Panama Canal, up the Chagres River, carrying all of the miners' equipment from the gold rush period, the tents, the shovels, the pans, through the jungles of Panama, rowing up the Chagres River, carrying them on their backs down the other side, and waiting with thousands of other miners from all over the world for a ship to carry them up to San Francisco and then on to Sacramento, which was the jumping off point for the gold rush. Many boats didn't want to carry African Americans, or they charged $300 more to transport an enslaved African American just because they could. People were competing, greedy, desperate for seats on those ships, places on those ships. I didn't know that there were plantation slaves in the gold rush, and I didn't know that the decision to maintain Black slavery, the slavery of enslaved African Americans, would be in fact written into California's Constitution. That part of California being admitted as a state to the United States was drafted in a brilliant loophole into the California Constitution. And then it's good for go. California starts to copy the laws from the East Coast that allowed slavery to continue, that allowed for the capture of runaway or fugitive slaves to be seized. I didn't know that there was this incredible meeting up around the 1850s, the decade right before the Civil War, of enslaved Blacks and free Blacks. Enslaved Blacks brought out to California didn't know that they were free. California's Constitution says slavery will never be tolerated in this state. The Constitution was written by slaveholders, and that loophole is written into the Constitution. Tolerate is not a legal standard.
No.
So they bought themselves an out in the way they drafted the Constitution. And that out becomes the good for go, copying laws from the East Coast for them to maintain the ownership of enslaved Blacks in California.
Right.
So as we look at all these different populations of enslaved people in California, even to take down, to question the most common awareness of slavery in the United States, which is still plantation slavery, that notion, that history, the one that is now not allowed to be taught in Florida. That enslaved people thrived under slavery because they learned how to be a blacksmith. If we hear that blacksmith trade one more time, it's ridiculous that anyone thrived under that brutality. But we're still fixated on plantation slavery as the only form of human bondage in the United States. Yeah.
Well, I mean, I always made this point when I taught the Atlantic slave trade to my Year 9 pupils, that that slavery has not ended, and it's perhaps more widespread now than it actually has ever been. And this is quite a sort of like it's quite a cathartic moment sometimes for school students as well.
It was for me.
Yeah, and I think there's some very interesting parallel processes. Whenever you look at British and American history, it doesn't exactly mirror each other, but it often rhymes. I think it's one fascinating thing about Britain and America. There is a process in Britain at the moment. Perhaps this has been learned from America. Perhaps Americans have learned this from Britain. I don't know. But of a huge amount of dark money is going into historical revisionism around the British Atlantic slave trade. A sort of a group of quite renowned historians, many of them who've kind of essentially disgraced themselves by coming out with this rubbish, have said things like, the British Empire was the good empire. If you could look at all the other ones, and the Belgians in the Congo, well, we weren't half that bad. And actually, we were the ones that abolished slavery, which is to sort of, it's a bit like a kind of a robber saying, well, I stopped robbing you at a certain point, and I should have kind of some sort of credit for that. Thank you very much. And all these other sorts of kind of revisionist, disingenuous, really kind of playing fast and loose with the facts sort of stuff. It's nothing quite as overt as DeSantis in Florida, actually saying, people benefited from slavery. But there is a tone of that, of that sort of slaves, they were blessed with Christianity, and You know, they were able to make. I think that one of the lines that has come up with over here is that if it wasn't for slavery, you wouldn't have got Black British culture or Black Caribbean culture. And you know, obviously the freed peoples in West Africa are now looking on in envy, wishing if only that could have been us, or whatever sort of nonsense. But I guess my question is why do you think we're having this now? What is it about now that means on both sides of the Atlantic there's this immense revisionism about slavery?
Well, I think there's very powerful right-wing movements. You know, sitting at the top of that is, of course, Donald Trump, and all of the, you know, that kind of revisionist history. I think that what I didn't know initially was that the links between Britain and the United States, that Britain wanted to come in on the side of Britain wanted to come in on the side of the South in the Civil War to feed all of the cotton in the mills up, you know, in the north around Manchester and north of Manchester. And in fact, when Britain decides not to come in on the side of the Civil War, they turn to Argentina and Egypt with all kinds of versions of unpaid, unfree labor in order to supply those mills, as well as ships and the insurance companies. If one takes a tour of Liverpool and goes to the amazing Slavery Museum in Liverpool, one sees the endurance of British slavery and the profitability of British slavery, and the fact that even though Britain committed to guard the coast of Africa from slave ships, they were kidnapping slaves off of those ships to sell for their own profit. That's a rather different story than what happened in California with the endurance of slavery. That a story that I very much like to teach is Frederick Douglass's The Great Abolitionist. Wrote one little piece of fiction. Frederick Douglass, the great abolitionist, wrote one little piece of fiction called The Heroic Slave. And it's the slave revolt on the ship the Creole, a true story. The leader of the revolt was Madison, Washington, and they end up in the Bahamas. And the slave revolt works. The enslaved people walk off the ship in the Bahamas, as does Madison, Washington. But the United States, and it's a fictionalized version, it's brilliant, but the United States pays Britain for the ship, and it pays Britain, who owned the ship, the Creole, pays it back for the slaves who walk off the ship in the Bahamas, because the soldiers, the formerly African soldiers and police in the Bahamas, free the enslaved people on the Creole. And the United States sticks it to Britain and says, you owe us for these people. And the United States government pays, as it did in other slave revolts, it pays Britain for those slaves. And that's happening, I believe it was 1847. So we're right on the lead up to the Civil War. So we're kind of shifting into Britain's complicity in our discussion. I think one of the things about slavery in California was that California was owned, controlled by a series of empires, not Britain. The Spanish enter first in 1769. They're carrying an order from the emperor, and also a bull from a decree from the Pope in Rome. And the order is to invade California and enslave and convert as many Native Californians, Native American Californians, they sort of guess right that there are several 100,000 Native Californians, Native American Californians. There are, in fact, 310,000. And so with this really funky little crew of 100 Spanish soldiers and 8 priests led by Junipero Serra, who was sainted in the past few years for doing this, they invade California at San Diego, the border with Mexico, and they're Franciscans, backed up by 100 very, very low-level Spanish soldiers. And they start to build a chain of 21 missions, which are agricultural slave plantations, with the goals of blocking Russia, who was coming into California from the north, of starting plantations that would feed the Spanish and enslaved miners in Mexico and Peru that would grow, so they didn't have to take time off of mining, that would grow the food to feed this empire project, a brutal empire project. The Spanish soldiers were really unhappy because they weren't going to get a cut of any of the silver coming out of the mines that they got when they were in Mexico and Peru. This was a really crummy, low-level assignment to go into the wilderness in California and do what? And it was brutal.
So we're looking. We must finish in a moment, Jean, for the Zoom clock ticks downwards. But I just think the final thought really is that there are these powerful connections throughout everything we talked about between essentially slavery, the functioning of empires, the development of this thing we call capitalism, and they are it's impossible to hive the 3 things off. They are a kind of almost a seamless whole, and the kind of the modern world in which we live is born of this.
Each empire that invades and controls California brings with it a slight variant, its own species of slavery. The Russians, which was a little-known story, come into California with kidnapped Alaska natives. They've crossed the Bering Straits and the Aleutian Islands, kidnapping Alaska natives for the otter trade. And when they've decimated the Alaska Native tribes and the otters, they turn right and they sail down into California for the otter trade and clash with the Spanish.
We're just going to run out of time in a second, Jean. I'm very, very sorry. Would you like, Jean, because this is such an interesting topic, would you like to make this a 2-parter? I would really love for you to continue this conversation as soon as possible. Would that be okay?
Sure. Yeah, I'd be delighted in it.
We'll be continuing with this interview, hopefully in the next couple of weeks. I think this has been one of the most extraordinary conversations we've had on the Explaining History podcast. I'm hugely grateful to Jean for the journey that we've been on this kind of hidden history of California. So I hope you'll join us for the next part of the interview. Again, I'll put an announcement on the channel or on the little social media things we do, letting you know. But I'd love your feedback. I'd love you guys to let me know what your thoughts were. There's innumerable ways of contacting me via YouTube and Twitter and all that kind of stuff, so I'm sure you'll figure that out. But it would be great to hear from you all, and let's hear more on this soon. Thanks ever so much. All the best.